They remember me as gold. Not my laws, not my songs, not the long hours spent turning anger into compromise before it could become tragedy. Not the quiet work of holding a kingdom together, one treaty, one marriage, one decision at a time. No, what outlived me was a question that still glitters. Where did Solomon's wealth come from? I hear it in every age, as if it's being asked in the same breath. Priests asked it under candlelight. Merchants asked it while weighing dust on scales. Kings asked it with envy hiding behind polite smiles. And much later, explorers asked it with blistered feet and maps full of empty space. The old words that fuel the obsession are simple enough. They speak of ships, of distant voyages, of riches returning on a rhythm, not every season, but on a cycle. Once every 3 years, a fleet came back with treasure and strange goods, and the names attached to those journeys, Tarshish, Ophir, became magnets for imagination. Even in my own story, those names behave like fog. Tarshish might be a faraway place, or it might be a way of saying a ship built for long distance. Ophir might be a coastline, a region, a trading network, or a symbol for the source. People want it to be a single point on a map because that feels satisfying. But the ancient world rarely worked that way. Still, I remember the feeling of the returns. Before the convoy appeared, the city sounded ordinary. Clay jars being set down, sandals on stone, animals complaining, children arguing over fruit, life moving at its usual pace. Then a runner arrived with salt still in his hair and on his skin, shouting that masts had been seen. And Jerusalem, my Jerusalem, changed its breathing. It wasn't just excitement, it was tension, like the air had been pulled tight. People leaned toward the harbor as if the entire city had become a single body, listening for the creak of ropes, the thump of oars, the first calls from the dock. When the ships finally came in, they didn't bring only metal, they brought distance. They brought proof that the world was larger than the hills beyond the city, larger than the desert that looks empty until it swallows travelers whole. They brought wood darker than our local timber, fragrant resins that seemed to carry the memory of foreign rains, carved ivory that made craftsmen go quiet, not out of worship, but out of professional awe. They brought curiosities that didn't fit the rhythms of our seasons. And yes, they brought gold. Not just ornaments, not the neat coins of later empires. I mean weight, raw weight, stacked and sealed and carried with care. The kind that changes what people are willing to do, what they are willing to forgive, and what they are willing to call truth. Here is something most stories don't say out loud. Wealth is never only wealth. Wealth is permission. It's the power to build walls and storehouses, to pay scribes and stonecutters, to keep caravans moving, to feed workers through hard years, to make plans real enough that they become skyline. Wealth buys time. It buys information. It buys advisors. It buys the ability to turn a kingdom into a listening device. Ears in every market, news from every road, rumors traveling faster than soldiers ever could. So when people ask where my gold came from, what they're really asking is something sharper. Who gave Solomon permission to become Solomon? And that question is dangerous because it turns into another one just as hungry. If there was a source, where is it now? That hunger didn't die with me. It migrated. Over time, my name stopped being just a name. It became a container for whatever each era wanted most. Wisdom, power, wealth, secrets. People took the rough edges of history and smoothed them into legend until the story could travel farther than facts usually can. My judgments became parables. My court became a stage where wisdom performed for the world. My buildings became proof of divine favor, stitched together in imagination by angels and accountants working side by side. And then the tale gained its most enduring echo. The idea that my wealth had to come from somewhere so extraordinary it deserved a myth of its own. That's how a word like Ophir becomes more than geography. It becomes a promise. Centuries later, readers would treat it like a treasure clue, one that had been hiding in plain sight. They would begin to argue over it as if the answer could be forced out of the earth with sheer determination. Some insisted Ophir must be in India because the ancient world did trade far, through layered networks and long chains of exchange. Others pointed toward Arabia, where incense kingdoms rose and caravans carried perfume and prestige. Others looked to Africa, because gold and ivory did move through coastal routes, and because the idea of a mysterious interior was irresistible to outsiders. But the truth, the kind that survives contact with evidence, is often less cinematic and more powerful. In the ancient world, wealth rarely came from one dramatic mine with a secret entrance. Wealth came from systems, from routes, alliances, ports, taxes, labor, protection, and the ability to keep a corridor safe long enough for merchants to risk their lives on it. It came from knowing who controlled a pass, who owned the harbor, who could guarantee that a caravan would arrive intact. And that's exactly why the texts frustrate people, because they don't hand you a map, they hand you a riddle. They say, ships went out, ships came back, wealth flowed. Names are given, Tarshish, Ophir, but the story refuses to become an accounting report. For some minds, that refusal is unbearable. A riddle does something strange to human beings. It invites certainty without requiring proof. And once someone feels certain, they begin to see confirmation everywhere, inside translations, inside similar-sounding place names, inside rumors, inside stones. That's how myths become expeditions. That's why long after my reign became a story in temples and halls, men would cross oceans and deserts convinced they could find the source of my gold, as if it were waiting, untouched, to reward whoever arrived with enough nerve. They would chase Ophir the way a thirsty traveler chases a mirage, because from far away it looks like water. And yet, I won't mock them for wanting to find it. The desire itself is ancient. People have always wanted the world to contain a hidden door, because if there is a door, then there is a key. And if there is a key, then history feels less random. It feels conquerable. But the deeper truth is this. Legends don't survive because they're accurate. They survive because they are portable. A careful explanation of trade networks rarely makes someone change their life. A story about a lost source of gold does. So my name became a kind of compass. And compasses don't only point north, they point toward desire. In time, that desire would pull explorers far south, toward stone walls fitted without mortar, walls that didn't belong to my century at all, yet would be chained to my reputation for generations. That is what happens when a myth meets a blank space on a map. The blank space doesn't stay blank for long. It fills with whatever the world is most eager to believe. And so before the ships, before the ruins, before the fever of treasure hunting hardened into certainty, there was only the question, shining in the dark. Where did Solomon's wealth come from? And somewhere behind that question, quiet, persistent, was the larger one people rarely admit they're asking. What is greatness made of? Gold? Or the systems that move it? I can still summon the morning she arrived, not as a perfect photograph, but with the kind of clarity that stories leave behind. Jerusalem was awake before sunrise. The city didn't need heralds to stir it. Anticipation itself was enough. We had heard the reports for days, a royal visitor, a vast procession, beasts of burden, attendants, guards, translators, and gifts heavy enough to require their own planning. When the caravan finally entered the city, it wasn't the gold that struck people first. It was the smell. Spices don't announce themselves like banners. They move through a crowd invisibly, and then, suddenly, you realize you're breathing a landscape you cannot see. Warm bark and sharp resins, sweet smoke, the memory of distant trees and distant rain. At the center of that moving horizon was the Queen of Sheba, however you choose to imagine her. Later generations would drape her in mystery until she felt almost supernatural. But if you strip away the poetry, her presence still makes sense in the plain language of power. A queen does not travel with a very great train for romance. She travels that way because the journey itself is a statement. It says, I have resources. I have discipline. I can cross harsh country and arrive not diminished, but magnificent. In the ancient world, logistics were a form of rhetoric. And there is another truth that the legend often hides. This kind of visit is rarely just curiosity. It is diplomacy with perfume on it. It is negotiation wrapped in ceremony. It is a ruler arriving not to be impressed, but to measure what kind of ruler she is facing. If Sheba was connected to the kingdoms of South Arabia, often linked with the ancient Sabaeans, then she came from a world shaped by the incense trade. Frankincense and myrrh moved north toward temples and courts. Those resins weren't luxuries in the way modern people think of luxury. They were tied to worship, to medicine, to status, to burial rites. They carried meaning. They were valuable because they were woven into how people understood the world. And gold. Gold is a language that doesn't need translators. It doesn't spoil. It doesn't rust. It doesn't argue about grammar. So when she brought gold, she wasn't only bringing wealth. She was bringing recognition, an acknowledgement that my court mattered enough to receive it, and that her court mattered enough to give it. We met the way rulers meet, with courtesy sharpened into competition. She had heard stories about my mind, about judgments, riddles, sayings collected and repeated until they sounded like miracles. And I had heard of her reach, her trade network, her independence, her ability to keep authority intact in a world that often tried to turn powerful women into footnotes. We spoke through interpreters at times, but power has its own vocabulary. A pause held too long, a glance that refuses to drop, a gift chosen too precisely to be accidental. The story says she tested me with questions. I believe that, because it fits the reality of kingship. Rulers are always testing each other, even in peace, not with blades, but with intelligence, with hypotheticals, with riddles that reveal how a mind moves under pressure. And I answered, not because I was a magician, but because I had something rarer than magic. I had time. That is what wealth buys a king before it buys monuments. Time to think, time to listen, time to gather advisors, time to turn travelers' reports into strategy, time to make a kingdom into a kind of instrument, an ear pressed against the wider world. So when Sheba looked at Jerusalem, at the storehouses, the building projects, the machinery of state, she wasn't only admiring, she was calculating. And when she offered gifts, she wasn't surrendering, she was investing. That's the question inside the gifts, the part most people rush past because spectacle is easier to remember than structure. Centuries later, readers would focus on the scene's glitter, camels, spices, gold in enormous measure. But a modern eye notices something else immediately. The text does not explain where the gold was mined. It tells you what arrived, not how it was extracted. It gives you the result, not the supply chain. It offers a name, Ophir, and then moves on, because the text is not an economic report. It is a story about wisdom, legitimacy, and the kind of prestige that draws prestige to itself. But the human mind hates a missing chapter. So later generations did what humans always do with missing chapters. They wrote them. Some placed Ophir in India because distant goods were moving across the ancient world through layered networks and because certain lists of exotic items sounded, at least to later readers, like the far edges of the East. Others placed Ophir in Arabia because incense kingdoms were real and wealthy and connected by caravans that shaped history. Others began to look toward Africa because gold and ivory did move through coastal routes and because a mysterious interior has always been irresistible to outsiders. And then language itself added fuel to the fire. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the version many later readers encountered, the word Ophir sometimes appears as Sophir, with an added sound at the beginning. It seems like a small change, the kind scribes and translations can produce over time. But centuries later, that small change would become a spark. Portuguese sailors reached a coastal port in southeastern Africa called Sofala, and when they heard the name and when they compared it to the Sophir they had seen in Greek scripture, imagination did the rest. To them, it didn't sound like coincidence, it sounded like evidence. A name became a clue became conviction, and conviction, especially when mixed with ambition, doesn't ask permission from evidence. This is how myth becomes a map, not because the myth is always false, but because it is unfinished, and unfinished stories invite people to complete them with whatever they already want to believe. From a modern point of view, it's important to say this carefully. The ancient world did have long-distance trade. Goods did move astonishing distances. Metals and resins and carved luxuries passed from hand to hand across deserts and seas. Fleets and caravans existed.
Diplomacy and gift exchange were real tools of statecraft. So the story isn't absurd, but the leap from trade exists to there must be one secret place that explains everything is a leap driven more by desire than by history. Because wealth in the ancient world rarely came from a single dramatic source. Wealth came from systems, from roots controlled and protected, from taxes collected, from alliances maintained, from ports that stayed open, from corridors that stayed safe. And that's why the names in the text, Tarshish and Ophir, remain slippery. Tarshish might be a destination in some context. In others, it may refer to a type of sea-going ship designed for long voyages. Ophir might refer to a region, or a trading horizon, or simply the place where gold comes from, the way later people say El Dorado without demanding a fixed coordinate. But here's the deeper reason the legend survives. A detailed explanation of economic networks rarely inspires anyone to cross an ocean. A legend does. A legend turns complexity into a single promise. Find the source and you inherit the magic. So, my name, Solomon, became a kind of magnet, not because it solved the world, but because it offered the world a riddle that could be carried in one hand. And once a riddle is portable, it can travel farther than facts, and it can survive longer than evidence. That is what happened after Sheba's caravan left my streets. Her perfume faded, the city returned to its ordinary sounds, but the question remained, quiet at first, then louder with every century. Where did the gold come from? And once that question hardens into obsession, it begins to pull people across maps the way tides pull ships. They stop asking what the story means. They start asking where the treasure is. And that's how, long after my reign turned to legend, a single altered syllable, Ophir, Sophir, Sophala, could help set whole generations on the same path, chasing a name as if it were a compass, convinced that history must hide a door.
If you want to understand how legends turn into real journeys, don't start with a ship or a treasure chest. Start with a child and a book. In the year 1847, in a small German town, a boy named Karl Mach received a gift for his 10th birthday, a world atlas. He opened it expecting to see the planet laid out like a finished story. Instead, he found something that felt like an accusation. Huge portions of Africa drawn as empty space. Coastlines, a few names, and then blankness. For most people, a blank map is just a blank map. For Mach, it was a challenge. It suggested that the world still contained secrets large enough to swallow a life. And from that moment, the atlas didn't simply show him geography. It gave him a purpose, to go where the page fell silent and fill in what Europe claimed it didn't know. As he grew older, that hunger didn't fade, it sharpened. He read obsessively, travel accounts, geography reports, anything that described routes, rivers, coastlines, and rumors. He trained his body for distance and discomfort. He learned languages. He studied medicine, astronomy, natural science, because in his mind, an explorer wasn't a visitor. An explorer was an instrument, someone who could measure, record, and survive. At first, his obsession wasn't Solomon. It was Africa itself. The mystery of the interior, the promise of discovery, the idea that a single person could step into the unknown and return with new knowledge. But then, in the middle of all that reading, he encountered something that snapped his curiosity into a specific shape. He found old Portuguese reports, voices from the 16th century, describing a place inland, a fortress or city of stone, built with remarkable skill, its blocks fitted together without mortar. The words were brief, almost casual, and that's what made them dangerous. They sounded like an eyewitness note, not a myth. And in Mach's mind, one detail burned brighter than the rest: stone without mortar. Because he had heard that kind of phrasing before, in the ancient story attached to Solomon's wealth, to the mysterious name Ophir, to the idea that somewhere there had to be a source worthy of legend. Mach didn't treat the biblical story as poetry. He treated it as a trail of clues. So when he read those Portuguese lines, he felt the click of a lock turning. Somewhere in southern Africa, he believed, the riddle was waiting. But belief alone doesn't move a man across oceans.
preparation does. And Mach spent years preparing as if he were building himself into a tool strong enough to withstand the world he wanted to enter. He taught to earn money, but he lived for the map. He practiced endurance walks. He learned to go without comfort. He studied the kinds of knowledge an explorer would need, because he knew no institution was going to hand him an expedition fully funded and neatly planned. Eventually, he went anyway. In the year 1865, he reached southern Africa with little money and stubborn determination. The reality did not match the romance. Travel was slow, food was uncertain, heat and distance worked on the body like a steady pressure. He had days when hunger became a kind of companion, when even small tasks, finding water, keeping moving, felt like negotiations with his own limits. Still, he kept walking. And then, in the year 1867, in the region known as Tati, near what we would now place around the borderlands of Botswana and Zimbabwe, Mach documented something that felt like proof. With help from a seasoned hunter, he found gold-bearing quartz and signs of older mining activity. The gold itself was real, the moment was real, the excitement was real. And just as importantly, the rumor of it spread fast. Camps formed, prospectors arrived. It became one of those sparks that turned distance into traffic. For Mach, it felt like the world was confirming his theory. Gold existed in the region. Ancient workings existed. The idea of Ophir in Africa stopped sounding like a fantasy and started sounding, at least to him, like a destination. But Mach wasn't satisfied with gold alone. He wasn't chasing a handful of glitter in a stream. He was chasing a story big enough to match Solomon. To truly prove he had found the place of legend, he believed he needed something else. A city, a monumental center, stone on a scale that would force Europe to pay attention. Around that same time, he began to hear whispers of abandoned walls, of great stone ruins inland, of buildings unlike anything Europeans expected to exist in that part of the world. The rumors pointed toward a mountainous country between two great rivers. The details were vague, as rumors are always, but they all carried the same emotional weight. Something old, something massive, something not easily explained. For years, Mach tried to reach it. He negotiated for guides. He traveled and returned again. Sometimes the obstacle was terrain. Sometimes it was politics. Sometimes it was distrust, his own and others. He lived by alliances, by fragile agreements, and by the constant need to manage risk without the safety net by having an empire behind him. And through it all, he kept one image in his mind: stone without mortar. A sentence from an old Portuguese report, a biblical riddle that had become personal. And by the time he finally stood within reach of the ruins, he was no longer just a curious traveler. He was a man carrying a conclusion in his pocket, waiting for the landscape to confirm it. He didn't know the name Great Zimbabwe, not yet. He didn't know the true age of the stones. He didn't know the civilization that had built them. What he knew, what he believed with the force of a bow, was that he was about to step into the place where a legend left its footprint. And when the first great wall arose from the landscape ahead of him, the world did something it rarely does for an explorer. It matched the sentence he'd been carrying for most of his life. I did not build the walls Karl Mauch went to see. And yet, for a long time, the world insisted on laying my name across those stones, like a traveler pressing a familiar label onto an unfamiliar place, just to make it feel understandable. From where I watch history unfold, I can tell you what happened the moment Mauch reached the ruins. It was September of 1871. Southern Africa was no longer a blank space on European maps, but to many Europeans, it was still a blank space in the imagination, waiting to be filled with whatever story felt most convincing. And Mauch arrived carrying two things that weigh more than any pack: assumptions and a legend. He had searched for years. He followed rumors like a sailor follows stars, not because each rumor is a destination, but because together they form a direction. Local communities guided him toward a place they already knew,
in the way people know landscapes that hold memory, old walls, old enclosures, a silence that doesn't feel empty. Then the stone appeared. Not as a tidy ruin, the way Europe liked its ruins, picturesque arches and ivy, but as something more startling. Massive walls made from fitted granite blocks, curving lines that felt deliberate, corridors that pulled you forward, then slowed you down, as if the architecture itself was deciding how you were allowed to move. And one detail struck Mouch like a bell in the chest. No mortar. Stone resting on stone with such precision that the wall held itself, like a breath held for centuries. He had read an old Portuguese account describing a stone fortress inland, built with astonishing craftsmanship, without mortar. Standing there, he felt the intoxicating shock explorers live for, the sense that the world has answered a sentence you've carried in your mind for years. To him, it wasn't just discovery, it was destiny agreeing with him. He described the ruins as a mighty fortress, split between a rocky hill complex and a great enclosure below. He walked the site with a mixture of reverence and possession, sketching, measuring, memorizing, and almost immediately he reached the conclusion that would shape everything that followed. He believed it was too great to be African. That belief didn't come from anything the stones themselves said. It came from the era that produced him, an era that too often confused unknown to us with impossible for them. When Europeans of that time encountered monumental work in Africa, many searched for foreign builders first: Phoenicians, Arabs, Israelites, anyone except the people whose descendants lived nearby. And into that gap between wonder and prejudice, my legend walked in wearing gold. Mouch did not see Great Zimbabwe first as Great Zimbabwe. He saw it as Ophir's shadow, as the answer to a biblical riddle, as proof. From a modern perspective, we can appreciate what he did without repeating what he claimed. He endured extraordinary hardship. He recognized that the site mattered. He helped bring attention to one of the most important ancient places in Africa. But he also misunderstood it, and that misunderstanding became famous. Because when you arrive already in love with a conclusion, you start collecting details the way a lawyer collects testimony, not to discover what is true, but to build the strongest case for what you've already decided. Mouch's next move shows that clearly. He searched for signs that could bind the ruins to the biblical world, and in the descriptions of Solomon's temple, one material appears again and again: cedar of Lebanon, prestigious, symbolic, famous. So Mouch looked for wood. He found remnants of beams, timbers associated with entrances and structural supports. He took a small sample, and then he did something that feels almost heartbreaking in its simplicity. He examined it with the tools he had. He compared its look and color to what he knew. He even compared it to the wood of a pencil he carried. And he decided it must be cedar. In his hands, the wood became not a specimen to test, but a relic to interpret. Another yes added to a chain of yeses. But later, when the site was studied with better methods, that cedar would not hold up. The timber was local hardwood, not imported cedar from the Levant. Mouch's conclusion wasn't a conspiracy. It was a product of limited technique mixed with a powerful expectation. And that expectation shaped everything. He began to imagine ancient Phoenician builders because 19th century Europe was fascinated by the Phoenicians as long-range traders, people who, in the European mind, could plausibly reach anywhere. He began to see the walls not as a local achievement, but as the fingerprint of outsiders. He began to frame the people around him as living among someone else's ruins. And this is where my name becomes more than a name. Solomon became a mirror that allowed an empire-minded age to see what it wanted to see: civilization arriving from elsewhere, history belonging to outsiders, Africa as a stage rather than an author. And once Mouch sent his reports back toward Europe, he gave editors and readers exactly what they craved: a lost city, a biblical connection, a hint of treasure, a European hero at the center of it all.
So the world responded the way it always responds to a dramatic discovery. It began to write the ending before the evidence had even been collected. But stone does not hurry. Stone does not flatter. Stone does not care what names you want to place on it. Great Zimbabwe was real, yes. Magnificent, yes. Worthy of awe, yes. But it did not belong to my time. It belonged to another history, another people, another story. One that would take decades to be heard clearly because the world first had to unlearn the myths it preferred. Mouch arrived at a city of stone and tried to make it mine. And for a while, the world agreed with him, because a legend is easier to swallow than a correction. But the stones were patient. They waited for a different kind of visitor, one who would listen with method, not hunger.
Gold has a strange kind of magic. Not the kind that sparkles in a storybook, but the kind that changes the way people speak. It turns maybe into must. It makes a weak clue feel like a strong one just because the prize is heavy enough. Karl Mauss's must had a name: Ophir. In his mind, the logic began to lock together like a chain. The Bible mentions Ophir and links it to gold. Later Greek translations sometimes render that word in a slightly different form: Sophir. Centuries after that, Portuguese sailors reached the port on the southeast African coast called Sofala. To a man already hungry for confirmation, the sound of Sofala felt like the echo of Sophir. And once you believe you've heard an echo, you start looking for the source. Then Mauss had more pieces to fit into place. Southern Africa had gold. He had seen it with his own eyes. Gold-bearing quartz, traces of old workings, signs that mining had been part of the land's long memory. And inland there were the ruins, immense stone walls, fitted without mortar, rising where Europeans did not expect such architecture to exist. So to him, the story tightened into certainty. Sofala must be the coastal doorway to Ophir. The ruins must be the great center described in old reports. The gold must be the same gold. And if it was the same gold, then the legend was no longer a legend. It was geography. From where you stand now, with modern archaeology, laboratory analysis, and a hard-earned distrust of easy conclusions, you can see how fragile that chain really was. It depended on language that only resembled itself across time. It depended on rumors traveling through many mouths. It depended on assumptions about who could build in stone. But to Mauss, it felt irresistible, because the strongest part of the chain wasn't evidence, it was desire. He wanted a single place that could explain everything, a source, a center, a name you could circle on a map and say, "Here, this is where the wealth began." That is how treasure legends work. They don't promise networks, they promise doorways. And yet, the reality of wealth, real historical wealth, almost never comes from a single doorway. It comes from systems, trade routes protected, taxes gathered, alliances negotiated, labor organized, information collected and used. Wealth is usually not a secret cave, it's a machine. Mauss did not see a machine, he saw a myth. And once he decided he had found my shadow in southern Africa, everything he observed began to bend toward that conclusion. The absence of inscriptions didn't slow him down. He treated it as if it fit the biblical story. The look of the walls didn't become a question, he made it an answer, comparing it to what he imagined ancient Near Eastern buildings should resemble. Even local accounts were filtered through the beliefs circulating in colonial society at the time, that foreign builders must be responsible for greatness. Here's the modern warning sign. When a person treats missing evidence as confirmation, the investigation has stopped being an investigation. It has become a performance. In Mauss's case, it was a performance built on a familiar script. Choose the grand conclusion first, then collect details that can be made to support it. And if something doesn't fit, either explain it away or treat it as proof that the story is even more mysterious than you thought. I don't say that to paint him as a villain. I say it because he was sincere. He believed what he wrote. His tragedy is that sincerity is not the same thing as accuracy. And still, this matters. He did find something real. Great Zimbabwe is not a fantasy. It is not an illusion. It is one of the great achievements of African history. The stones are not symbolic. They are physical. They are brilliant. They are patient. And they deserved to be understood on their own terms. Modern archaeology shows that Great Zimbabwe was not built in my time, and it was not built by Phoenicians, Israelites, or any other imagined foreign civilization. It flourished in the medieval period, roughly from the 12th through the 15th centuries, and it was built by ancestors of Shona-speaking peoples. Its power came from cattle wealth, agriculture, skilled craft production, and control over trade routes that connected the interior to the wider Indian Ocean world. That is not a smaller story than mine. It is a larger one, because it belongs to the people who made it. But in the 19th century, much of Europe was not ready to accept that, so my name became a shortcut, a familiar label used to explain unfamiliar greatness. Solomon was easier for Europeans to pronounce than African civilization, because Solomon already fit the stories they wanted to tell about the world. That is the deepest reason Mauss's Ophir theory spread so quickly. It wasn't just exciting, it was convenient. A lost biblical city made sense to people who already believed the Bible was a map. A powerful African state did not make sense to people who had been taught, wrongly, that Africa had no monumental past of its own. So the legend grew. Ophir became a destination in the popular imagination. Sofala became a proof because it sounded similar to Sophir. Great Zimbabwe became a palace because the world wanted it to be someone else's. And that is how a name becomes a spell, not because the name is true, but because it is persuasive. Mauss chased a riddle and found a city. He simply misread what the city was saying. And that misreading, amplified by newspapers and hungry minds, would soon explode into something bigger than scholarship, a cultural fever, a story that would make fortune for others and leave the man who began it with very little in return. Because once a myth catches fire, it doesn't ask who lit the match. It only asks how far it can spread. When a discovery becomes famous, it rarely rewards the discoverer in proportion to the fame. Karl May's reports, carried back to Europe, repeated in newspapers, amplified by geography societies, set loose an idea that spread faster than evidence ever could. The idea was simple, irresistible, and dangerous. Somewhere in southern Africa lay a lost city tied to biblical wealth. And then literature arrived, like a spark landing on dry paper. A novelist took the rumors, the sketches, the fever of a mysterious interior, and forged it into an adventure story so successful that it reshaped the public imagination. The phrase King Solomon's Mines began to sound ancient, as if it had always existed. But it wasn't ancient. It was modern, newly minted, perfectly designed to hook the mind. The offer offered everything the age loved most: a vast unknown, a hidden city, the promise of treasure, the fantasy that a single journey could turn an ordinary life into legend. It didn't need to be archaeologically true. It only needed to be emotionally precise. And it was. People read it in taverns and drawing rooms. They whispered about it at docks. They pinned the idea to maps like a nail. Some came for glory, some for fortune, and many came simply because the story made the world feel larger and more dramatic than their daily lives. My name, Solomon, became more than a figure in scripture. It became a brand, a banner under which people could chase a dream. Meanwhile, the man whose footsteps had helped bring Great Zimbabwe to global attention received almost none of the wealth his story generated for others. Ma returned to Europe physically worn down and increasingly ill. He hoped, understandably, for recognition, perhaps a position in a museum, a place among scholars, a stable life built on the work he had done.
But he lacked the credentials and patronage that the academic world often demanded, and he carried the rough edges of a self-made outsider. So, the doors he expected to open did not open. Instead of a university post or a curator's desk, he found himself pushed toward survival. He took work in a factory. His health deteriorated. Depression settled in like a second illness. Pain became constant enough that he reached for whatever dulled it. And then came the ending that history preserves with uncertainty. In the year 1875, still a young man, Karl May fell from a window in Stuttgart and died days later. Some accounts suggest an accident, others suggest despair. The truth is blurred, and the blur itself is part of the tragedy. The world that had turned his discovery into entertainment did not keep careful record of the man behind it. With his death, his reputation faded. Not because his story wasn't dramatic, but because drama is not evidence. His reports were short, published in German, easy to overlook if you weren't already inside his circle. For decades, much of the academic world treated his conclusions as speculation, useful as a travel narrative, but unreliable as history. And yet, the legend he helped ignite continued to grow. That's the strange thing about myths. They can outlive their authors. They can become more famous than the people who first carried them. They can generate fortunes while leaving the original source forgotten. For a time, it looked as if Great Zimbabwe had been successfully captured by the Solomonic fantasy. People spoke of Phoenicians and lost temples. They repeated the no-mortar detail like a password. They searched the ruins the way characters search in novels, certain that the stones were hiding a secret meant to be found. But history was changing. A new kind of explorer was emerging, less romantic, less biblical in their certainty, more disciplined in method. Archaeology as a science was beginning to demand something Ma could not provide: dates, layers, objects in context, careful excavation, careful recording, not just compelling connections. In that changing world, his interpretation of the ruins would not survive. Still, his role remains complicated. He was wrong about the age of the city, wrong about who built it, wrong about the idea that it belonged to Solomon's world. But he was right about one thing that matters enormously. The ruins mattered. They were real. They were magnificent. They demanded attention. And in a strange, bittersweet way, his mistake helped push Great Zimbabwe into the global conversation. He chased a legend and stumbled on someone else's greatness. If he had lived in a century less burdened by racial myth and imperial certainty, he might have recognized what he had truly found, not the leftovers of an imagined foreign empire, but the architecture of a powerful African civilization, one that built in stone with confidence and artistry. But he lived in an age that found it easier to place my name, Solomon, on African walls than credit African builders. That was the deeper distortion, the one that did real harm. So when modern archaeology finally arrived, it didn't just correct a date, it corrected a worldview. And that is where the next chapter begins, when pottery, trenches, and careful measurements start to speak louder than romance. Because stone can be misunderstood for a long time. But stone is patient, and sooner or later, it forces the story to change. Legends are loud. They arrive with trumpets, names that sound ancient, translations that almost match, rumors repeated until they harden into certainty. They can cross oceans without losing their power because they don't travel as facts, they travel as promises. But stone is not loud. Stone waits. And if you want the truth from stone, you need patience, method, and the humility to accept an answer that might disappoint the story you came to tell. After Karl May died, the idea he helped unleash didn't die with him. If anything, it grew stronger. Great Zimbabwe became a stage where Europe projected its fantasies. Visitors arrived not asking, "What is this place?" but insisting which part of our world built it. In the late 19th century, many antiquarians looked at those walls and searched for foreign fingerprints, Phoenician, Arab, ancient Semitic, not because the ground demanded it, but because the colonial imagination did. In that world, claiming the ruins as foreign-made wasn't just an academic mistake, it was a political tool. If the greatest stone city in the region could be framed as someone else's work, then the monumental past could be separated from the people living there. My name, Solomon, kept being used like a seal pressed into wax. Then a different kind of visitor arrived. Not a romantic seeker, not a treasure hunter, a professional trained to let objects speak before stories did. His name was David Randall MacIver. When MacIver examined Great Zimbabwe in the early 1900s, his approach was deceptively simple, and that's what made it powerful. He paid attention to the ordinary debris of life, especially pottery, and asked a question myths hate. When was this made? Because pottery is stubbornly honest. Styles change over centuries. Clay tells you about local traditions. Imported pieces can anchor a site to wider trade networks with known dates. Pottery doesn't care what people wish were true. Randall MacIver's conclusion cut straight through decades of romantic certainty. The ruins were not from the time of Solomon. They were medieval. And the material culture was African. To modern ears, that sounds almost obvious. But to many people at the time, it was shocking. Because the entire foreign origin theory, going back to Mach's biblical imagination, depended on the site being thousands of years older than it actually was. If Great Zimbabwe was medieval, then it couldn't be Ophir, and it couldn't be a Solomonic palace. The whole legend collapsed under the weight of a simple timeline. But legends do not surrender quietly. Even after MacIver, many colonial officials, settlers, and popular writers resisted, not because the evidence was weak, but because the implication was uncomfortable. If Africans built Great Zimbabwe, then the story Europeans had told themselves about Africa, about lack of history, about civilization arriving from elsewhere, could no longer stand. So the debate lingered. The myth continued to circulate. The stones remained famous, but wrongly explained. Then came the person who would deliver the most decisive blow to the fantasy, with an excavation so disciplined it left very little room to pretend. Gertrude Caton Thompson. In 1929, Caton Thompson led an excavation at Great Zimbabwe, which was, for its time, exceptionally rigorous. Her strategy mattered. She focused on areas undisturbed by earlier digging and treasure-seeking. She used controlled trenches and careful recording. She built her argument not from resemblance or rumor, but from layers in the ground and objects in context. And her verdict was clear. Every line of evidence supported a medieval date, and the ruins were indigenous, born of the land and the people who lived there. There was no material foundation for Phoenician builders, no buried layer of foreign occupation, no hidden ancient white civilization beneath the stonework. What was there, pottery, tools, settlement traces, belonged to local African cultures. This wasn't just a correction of a date, it was a correction of a habit of imagination. Even details that had been used as proof for foreign origins fell apart under scrutiny. Karl Mach's famous wood sample, the splinter he thought must be cedar of Lebanon, turned out to be local hardwood. His method for identifying it had been little more than an eyeballed comparison. He wasn't dishonest, he was simply limited by his time and shaped by his assumptions. That's a crucial modern lesson. Early explorers could stand for decades on confidence alone, because there wasn't yet a discipline strong enough to test their claims quickly. It could take 30 or 40 years before professional archaeologists arrived, excavated properly, and said clearly, no, this is not what you think. In the case of Great Zimbabwe, the answer was no. It was not connected to Solomon's imagined mines. It was not the Palace of Sheba. it was not a Phoenician outpost. It was something far more important. It was evidence of brilliant African achievement in the medieval period, monumental architecture, complex society, long-distance trade, and political power expressed in stone. So does that mean Mock's quest was worthless? Not entirely, because while his conclusions were wrong, his discovery helped bring Great Zimbabwe into the global spotlight. And once the site was finally studied with care, the world could begin, slowly, unevenly, to recognize it for what it truly was. Stone waited, and when the right methods arrived, stone answered.
If I could speak to Karl Mao now, not as a king, but as a fellow prisoner of stories, I would tell him this. You did not find my city, but you found a city that should have been allowed to keep its own name, Great Zimbabwe. Even the name is a declaration. It carries the idea of houses of stone, a plain statement of fact that doesn't ask for foreign builders and doesn't beg for permission from anyone's mythology. It simply says, this is stonework made into home, authority, and memory. So, let's look at what the ground and the evidence actually suggest, without forcing my shadow across someone else's walls. Between roughly the 1200s and the 1400s, Great Zimbabwe became the center of a powerful African polity. It did not rise overnight. Like any real capital, it grew through the slow accumulation of competence, agriculture that could feed thousands, cattle wealth that stored value and status, skilled craft production, and the ability to control resources and routes. This wasn't a lonely fortress waiting for outsiders to discover it. It was a living place. Residences, courtyards, workshops, ceremonial spaces, and passages designed not only for movement but for meaning. The architecture itself performed power. Narrow corridors could control who approached and how. Tall walls could conceal spaces and reveal them only to those permitted. The city wasn't just built to stand, it was built to organize life. And that stonework, so often treated in older European writing as impossible for Africans, becomes completely understandable once you stop asking the wrong question. Dry stone walls don't require foreign bloodlines. They require skill passed down, selecting stone, shaping it, knowing how to place weight on weight, understanding how a wall breathes with heat and time, organizing labor, having patience, building not for a season, but for generations. In other words, they require what every civilization requires: people, knowledge, and time. Great Zimbabwe's wealth was not the glittering fantasy gold of treasure fiction. It was the kind of wealth that actually builds states. Archaeology shows that the Zimbabwe Plateau was tied into long-distance exchange networks. Imported goods, glass beads, ceramics, and other items appear in the archaeological record, pointing to connections that reached beyond the horizon. These imports help date the site and place it within a medieval Indian Ocean world. That matters because it changes the story completely. You don't need to imagine a Solomonic fleet sailing straight into a hidden African harbor. You need to imagine a web. Gold from the interior moved outward through systems of exchange. Ivory moved too. Goods from distant markets came back inward. A capital that could organize production, secure routes, and negotiate power could grow wealthy enough to build in stone and important enough that people far away would trade for what it controlled. When you see it this way, the true wonder of Great Zimbabwe becomes larger, not smaller. It's not a footnote to my story. It's a chapter of human history that stands on its own. And then there are symbols, evidence that point inward, not outward. One of the most iconic finds associated with Great Zimbabwe is the carved soapstone birds.
They are not copies of Mediterranean motifs. They look like a local visual language, a way of representing authority and sacred meaning through form. They suggest political and spiritual systems that cannot be reduced to foreign influence without stripping the culture of its voice. Once you let Great Zimbabwe speak for itself, you stop asking which outsiders built this. You start asking better questions. How was leadership organized here? How did sacred space work? How did architecture enforce social order? How did trade reshape identity and power? How did the city manage resources, food, water, labor at scale? And finally, the question every great site raises: why did it decline? By the 15th century, Great Zimbabwe was largely abandoned as a major center. Modern scholarship resists single-cause answers, and that caution is wise. Cities don't fall like cursed temples in adventure novels. They transform. People move, power relocates, trade routes shift, new capitals rise. Likely factors include changing trade patterns, political reorganization, environmental pressures, and the slow exhaustion of local resources. The decline wasn't a sudden mystery, it was history behaving like history. So what do we do today with the old legend that tried to claim these stones? Here's the paradox. Removing my name from Great Zimbabwe doesn't make the story less epic, it makes it more honest. And honesty in this case restores something that was stolen, not gold, but credit. For too long, the world found it easier to attach African achievement to foreign names. Great Zimbabwe was forced to wear my crown because Europe wasn't ready to celebrate an African crown. But once archaeology corrected the date and the authorship, the site could finally be seen in its own light. A masterpiece of medieval African architecture and statecraft, woven into global trade and rooted in local genius. The stones did not need Solomon, they needed listeners. And now that we've learned to listen better, the city's real story becomes the greater treasure. Proof that Africa was never a blank space, never a stage without actors, never a continent waiting for history to arrive from elsewhere. Stone does not lie. It can be misunderstood, it can be renamed, it can be claimed by louder voices. But if you return to it with patience, it gives you back a truer story than any legend can tolerate. And Great Zimbabwe, when allowed to speak, tells a story not of borrowed glory, but of enduring human brilliance. Built in stone, carried by trade, and remembered long after the voices that tried to rename it have faded.
I have been many things to many centuries. A proverb, a warning, a patron of impossible building projects, a magician disguised as a monarch, a name people reach for when they want the past to feel certain. But to modern archaeology, I am something less comfortable. I am a question mark wearing a crown. For a long time, scholars looking beyond scripture said there's no evidence for David or Solomon outside the Bible, and it wasn't an insult, it was method. The ground simply hadn't produced a line that stepped out of the text and into stone. Then in the early 1990s, something shifted. At a site in northern Israel called Tel Dan, archaeologists uncovered fragments of an Aramaic victory inscription, generally dated to the 9th century before Christ. Among its broken lines was a phrase many scholars read as House of David. That matters because it suggests that within a few generations after David's traditional time, neighboring kingdoms recognized a dynastic entity associated with his name. It doesn't prove every detail in the Bible. It doesn't confirm the drama or the scale or the poetry, but it does something powerful. It takes David out of the category of only in Scripture and places him, at least in part, into the world of external reference.
And once David's line becomes more plausible as history, my own name, Solomon, becomes harder to dismiss outright. Not proven, not confirmed in the way people hope for, but more plausible within a real, developing Iron Age context. Here's where the modern lens has to stay honest. Even with Tel Dan, we don't have a stone that says clearly and directly, Solomon, son of David, did this. Jerusalem itself is notoriously difficult to excavate in deep, clean layers because later construction and the realities of a living, contested city make archaeology complicated. So the debate shifts to scale. Some scholars see the 10th century as the era of a substantial, centralized kingdom. Others see smaller highland polities that grew into larger states later. Evidence is uneven. Interpretations vary. This is not the clean, cinematic courtroom people want. Archaeology rarely is. And there's a temptation here to overprove, to treat every fragment as if it must confirm a full narrative. But archaeology is not a witness who saw everything. It's a collection of traces that survived by chance, not fairness. So when someone asks, did Solomon exist? The best modern answer is careful and restrained. Possibly, increasingly plausibly within the reality of emerging states and regional power in the early Iron Age. But the grandest portraits of my wealth and building, the most glittering versions, are likely shaped by later storytelling. Memory expanded into theology, history embroidered into meaning. Yet even if you reduce me to a more modest historical ruler, the core question remains. If a kingdom in the southern Levant did grow in wealth and complexity, where did that wealth come from? And this is where we have to correct something that popular culture has hardened into fact. The Bible never actually says Solomon's mines. That phrase, so famous it feels ancient, is modern. It was popularized by a 19th century adventure novel and repeated so often it began to sound like scripture itself. But in the biblical text, you don't get a clear treasure map. You get trade, you get ships, you get long journeys, you get names, Ophir and Tarshish, that remain debated. Ophir is associated with gold, yes, but the text doesn't pin it down on a map. Tarshish might mean a distant place in some contexts, and in others it seems to describe a type of seagoing vessel built for long routes. The language is slippery because the world it comes from was a world of networks, not a world of single-source answers. And that brings us back to the deeper point. Wealth in the ancient world usually doesn't come from one hidden chamber in one mountain. It comes from systems, from controlling and taxing routes, from alliance and diplomacy, from agriculture and labor, from the ability to keep commerce moving in a dangerous world, from the machinery of administration, storehouses, scribes, agreements, protection. If my court prospered, it likely prospered through some mix of all of that. So the obsession with one secret mine is not really a historical question, it's a psychological one. People want a single source because a single source feels conquerable. It feels like a door. It feels like a key. But history usually is a web, and webs don't have one entrance. Still, the question of metals matters, because metals are where ancient power often becomes visible. Through trade, through taxation, through production, through strategic control. And once you start thinking that way, the old phrase, Solomon's mines, begins to transform. Maybe it was never about a single gold site at all. Maybe the real wealth, if it existed in historical terms, was built from something more practical: roots, diplomacy, and resources that could be managed and traded across a region. That doesn't make the story less epic. It makes it more real. Because the true measure of a kingdom isn't whether it found a magical mountain of gold, it's whether it could organize people, protect movement, and turn a landscape into a functioning network, strong enough that even centuries later, we are still arguing over the shape of its shadow.
If you want to feel how myths survive in the age of evidence, follow what happens when a legend about gold quietly transforms into a question about copper. Because once you stop asking, where is the one secret mine, and you start asking, how did wealth really work in that world, the story changes shape. It becomes less like an adventure novel and more like a serious investigation into power, into labor, trade, and industry. To modern ears, copper sounds ordinary. It doesn't glitter the way gold does. It doesn't announce itself as treasure. But in the ancient world, copper was capability. Copper could be shaped into tools. It could be traded in bulk. It could support armies, farms, workshops, and building projects. And in many periods, control over copper production meant control over something strategic, something every neighboring power needed. So, if you're trying to imagine how an early kingdom might grow rich, copper often makes more sense than the fantasy of one hidden mountain of gold. That's why one of the most intriguing modern discoveries connected to this debate isn't a golden vault, it's an industrial landscape. In southern Jordan, in the region of the Araba, archaeologists have excavated a major copper production center called Hidabat en Nahas, the ruins of copper. What they found there wasn't a single mine entrance framed for a story, it was evidence of large-scale production, furnaces, slag heaps, and the hard debris of industry. The dating is what makes it so compelling. Research teams working there have argued that major phases of copper production occurred in the 10th and 9th centuries before Christ, right in the general timeframe traditionally associated with David and Solomon. Now, here is where modern honesty matters. Finding copper production in that period does not prove Solomon personally controlled it. It doesn't mean we found Solomon's mines. Archaeology rarely hands us names in neat labels. But it does something important. It puts the economic question back on the table. It shows that this region had the political organization and labor systems capable of industrial-scale metal production. It shows that the world behind the biblical stories was not automatically a myth world. It was a real landscape of real economies, sometimes more complex than earlier scholars assumed. And once you accept that, you begin to see why the old treasure hunt framing is misleading. A kingdom's wealth would have come less from one secret place and more from controlling systems, production, movement, and exchange. Copper isn't just metal, it's a network. Miners, smelters, charcoal production, transport, trade agreements, protection, administration. It's the kind of wealth that doesn't sparkle in a story, but does build states. What about Ophir and Tarshish, the names that keep pulling people back into the riddle? They remain slippery, and a modern view is comfortable admitting that. Ophir might point towards South Arabia in some interpretations. It might reflect a broader trading horizon rather than a single location. Some have proposed East Africa, others have suggested India or beyond, often based on lists of exotic goods. But those lists may reflect multiple eras, multiple routes, or even symbolic language. The evidence doesn't allow a single confident pin dropped on a map. Tarshish is similar. It may refer to a distant place in some passages, but ships of Tarshish also seems at times to describe a kind of long-range ship rather than one fixed destination. In other words, the text doesn't give you a treasure map, it gives you a horizon. And when you treat horizons like coordinates, you get lost. That's what happened to the Victorian obsession with a single motherlode. It wasn't driven by archaeology, it was driven by imagination, and by the modern hunger to turn history into a prize. That brings us finally back to Sheba. The Queen of Sheba remains elusive in direct archaeological confirmation, but the wider world that could produce such a story is historically credible.
Wealthy kingdoms in South Arabia were real. Long-distance trade in incense and luxury goods was real. Diplomatic gift exchange between courts was real. And stories of rulers testing each other with riddles fit ancient literary tradition and political reality. So, the Sheba narrative may carry memory shaped into meaning, a story that teaches what kingship should look like. Not conquest, but prestige. Not force, but reputation. Wisdom powerful enough to attract gifts without war. And now we can say the quiet truth that sits beneath all of this. Solomon's mines are not one location, they are a human habit. They are the urge to compress complex systems into a single secret door, the desire to believe that history hides a key and that whoever finds it will inherit the magic of the past. But myths are not worthless. They move people. They fund expeditions. They build libraries. They inspire novels. And they can also distort reality, stealing credit, rewriting ownership, turning real achievements into someone else's story. Great Zimbabwe is the clearest warning of what happens when myth becomes a weapon. So what do we do with these legends now? We keep the wonder, we keep the questions, but we refuse the lazy answer that says greatness must come from elsewhere or from a single miraculous source. Great Zimbabwe is great without Solomon, and Solomon, if he existed as history and not only as scripture, was likely great not because he owned a magical vein of gold, but because he stood at a crossroads of people, roots, metals, and meanings. Gold dazzles the eye. Stone outlasts the eye. And somewhere between glitter and endurance, human beings keep building myths, then returning with tools to test them. That cycle is the real story. Not a mine, a mind.